I find it really interesting that the church has reserved one whole book of the New Testament to be exclusively read during the Easter season, and then at almost no other time in the year. I think that's quite interesting. This book, of course, is the Acts of the Apostles. And the Acts of the Apostles tell the story of the early church. It's totally entwined in the reality of the resurrection and the Great Commission, the great sending out of those disciples. And if you read the opening verses to the Acts of the Apostles, you will see that clearly laid out right from the start as a letter which St. Luke writes to Theophilus. Well worth a read. What we see as we follow the Acts of the Apostles, as we will do throughout the weekdays and on the weekends in this Lent, Advent, Christmas, Easter season, I got that at the end, is that it's the Holy Spirit who is the chief protagonist of mission, not those disciples. The Holy Spirit is the chief protagonist of mission, not those disciples. If they were left to their own devices, we get a glimpse of what would have happened, how things would have panned out in the end. Perhaps they would have continued to hide away as they were doing this time last week. Perhaps some of them would even run away, as we heard on Wednesday or Thursday, as we reflected upon those two disciples we meet on the road to Emmaus. They were running away, go in the opposite direction. Perhaps some of them would go back to their former lives, as we saw on Friday, I think, in the readings at Mass, where they went back fishing. They went back to what they were used to, going back to their former lives. It is the outpouring of the Holy Spirit and the continual presence of the Holy Spirit in their lives which guides them and which continues to guide them. In receiving the outpouring of the Holy Spirit at that first Pentecost, itself recorded very early on in the Acts of the Apostles, they did not hesitate but to bring to reality the great commission that they had received from the Lord before his ascension, that go out into all the world, proclaim to all of the nations the good news. Those apostles have continued to share down the ages the fruits of that Pentecost moment. That this outpouring of the Holy Spirit and their sending out into the world is something which comes directly from God himself and from no one else. And that God continues to communicate himself. God continues to reveal himself through the power of the Holy Spirit. And so, as we begin to focus in on today's reading from the Acts of the Apostles, we begin to get a real sense of how that sending out to all of the nations is beginning to bear fruit in that early church. We hear, as we reflect upon that first reading, we hear of the numbers of men and women who come to believe in the Lord increasing steadily. That encounter with those apostles is an encounter with the person of Jesus himself, the risen Lord. Compels them to come closer, to find out what it's all about. We hear in that first reading of the signs and the wonders which were worked among the people at the hand of those disciples. We get a sense, don't we, that we can see that the outpouring of the Holy Spirit was, for those apostles and those early Christians, something which was totally transformative, totally illuminating. And what they witness in those apostles is the face of Jesus, that intrigue that just draws them in. I think we can forget sometimes that the Holy Spirit is still a vital principle of the early church. The Holy Spirit continues to be the chief protagonist for mission, our starting point, our journey, and our end point of our own sending out into the world. Indeed, it is the Holy Spirit which bears fruit in us, not through our own efforts and our own achievements. We may find ourselves looking back to that first reading and reflecting upon it and asking ourselves, and quite rightly, where are the signs and the wonders being worked among us? Perhaps as we listen to those readings with our 21st century among us. Perhaps as we listen to those readings with our 21st century understanding of the world, we now see the supernatural as being something of a superstition. And of course, superstition is something which needs to be got rid of at all costs. If we remove the supernatural element from the life of our parish, from the life of the diocese or the wider church in general, what do we have left? Not a lot, I would suggest. I suggest that we would become something akin to a private members' club. To remove the power of the Holy Spirit as the chief protagonist of our very identity, of our very purpose, is extremely serious and very dangerous. Without the supernatural, without the inspiration and power of the Holy Spirit working in us and working through us, we will ultimately wither away and die because we cannot sustain ourselves. And so we hear time and again, not only in the Acts of the Apostles, but in the writings of St. Paul, that sentiment of the signs and wonders being worked among the people. How are these signs being worked here in our own parish, in our own diocese? How is the outpouring of the Holy Spirit inspiring each and every one of us anew? Indeed, do we take that time to step back and to pause and to listen for those promptings and inspirations of the Spirit? Pope Francis, throughout his whole pontificate, has invited us, hasn't he, to go back to the beginnings of everything, to go back to the big basics, to go back to that baptismal vocation of ours, and how that baptismal vocation, that life in the Holy Spirit, is something which is transformative, which will renew the face of the earth. He reminded us a few years ago that it is the Holy Spirit, he says, who carries us forward. He says that we need to be faithful to the vocation that the Spirit is moving us to do. And that is nothing less than the proclamation of the gospel. And where we do see shoots of new life blossom in our parish through the working of the Holy Spirit, let us take time to thank God for them, to offer these special moments back to him, whether it's a forthcoming wedding, a sequence of baptisms of our young people, baptism of our adults who have come forward. All of these are shoots of new life, moments in which we thank God for. The Holy Spirit has something special in store for us. With that, I have no doubt. Let us become sensitive to the promptings of the Holy Spirit in our lives. Let us be faithful to the vocation that the Spirit is moving us to do, whatever that is.